Hello, students. It is time for math notes. Please put the title on your paper. We are going to be learning vocabulary for functions. Please put the title on your paper, vocabulary for functions. The first word you need to write down, or phrase, is a function of. Put that on your paper, please. Is a function of. And I'm going to teach you what this means. When someone says is a function of, it means depends on. Put that on your page. Depends on. Okay, let me give you an example. Here's a very, very basic example. Y is a function of x. And I'll give an equation like y equals 3x plus 2. What this means, the value of y depends on the value of x. Please write that in your notes. And I'll give you another example. Here's another example. Time is a function of distance. Write that on your paper, that sentence, that statement. Time is a function of distance. And I'll give you an example of that. Let's say we have this equation for the time it takes to drive somewhere. And you're driving like 60 miles an hour, then it's going to be distance divided by 60. So this means the time it takes to get there depends on how far away it is at the same speed. Farther away takes longer time. Time depends on the distance. And then I'm going to give you one more example. One more example. Let's say there's a circle and you want to calculate the circumference of different size circles. Then you'll say circumference is a function of circle diameter. I'll write that down. Circumference is a function of circle diameter. And what that means is the circumference of the circle depends on what its diameter is. Here's an equation for that. Circle equals pi times d. D is the diameter. The circumference of the circle depends on the diameter. Please write down those 3 examples. I'll give you 1 second to do that. I'm making a video why I didn't stop. There's paper on the back table. Okay. Pause the video if you need more time to write this down. What's that? C equals pi times d. Let me make it a little darker. Actually, I shouldn't use my light pens. They don't show up that well. There we go. Oh, the line on the board. There we go. examples on your paper. These are examples of the expression is a function of. So whenever you hear is a function of, remember that means it depends on something. Something depends on something else. Now, when we say y is a function of, y is a function of x, notice that y comes first in the equation. Y depends on x. This is an important thing to notice because later you need to write equations that are a function of something, and you'll need to know how to write that equation. Look at the next example. Time is a function of distance, so time comes first. Time depends on distance. And in the third example, circumference is a function of circle diameter. So in the equation, circumference comes first. Circumference depends on the diameter of the circle. So in your homework assignments, when they say something like, the time is a function of distance, you know time comes first. Or if they say the volume of a cube is a function of the side length, write an expression, then you know the volume of the cube comes first. The volume of the cube depends on the side length, which would be side length cubed. You'll see that later in your assignments. Okay, let's keep going with vocabulary. And I'll use this expression that I just wrote down. Remember I said the volume of a cube, you can write this on your paper. The volume of a cube is a function of side length. And just in case it's been a while, let me draw a picture here of a cube. And you can remember that a cube has equal side lengths. And we're calling that S. So the volume is side length times side length times side length. And that's why we have S cubed. Now I'm going to teach you dependent variable and independent variable. Here are two very important vocabulary words. And I'm going to label the V, that is my dependent variable. The volume of the cube is a function of side length. In other words, the volume of the cube depends on side length. So we call it the dependent variable. And the side length of the cube, we call that the independent variable. You need to know the names independent variable and dependent variable because in your assignment, you're going to learn how to rearrange equations so that you can choose which one will be the dependent variable or the independent variable. I'll give you an example of that. I'll give you just a second more to write this down, and then we're going to go to the next page in our notes. Okay, so far you have learned the expression is a function of, which means depends on. You have learned dependent variable and independent variable. I want you to be sure and notice the dependent variable comes first. That is what your answer will be. You'll see why later. The dependent variable comes first. The dependent variable comes first. Make sure you notice that. Now, I'm going to go to the next page, and I want to teach you that functions can be described in 4 different ways. So go ahead and title this page, How to represent a function. How to represent a function. And there are 4 different ways to represent a function. First, you can have a description. A description, or we'd call that just a statement. Write that down. And I'm going to give you a statement that you'll actually see in your homework assignment. So here's an example, and I'm going to use the same example for all 4 ways to represent a function. The statement or description is the value of some quarters n number of quarters. The value, oops, I spelled value wrong. As you all know by now, I'm really bad at spelling. Value only has 1 L, and I forgot the U. There, the value of some quarters, n, which is number of quarters, is a function. Oh, I got it wrong. I should stop my notes. I have it backwards. The value of some quarters, cross that out. V, sorry, the value of some quarters V, I'll give you a second to cross that out in your notes. I skipped ahead in my mind. The value of some quarters V is a function of n, the number of quarters. Okay, listen to the statement again. The value of some quarters V is a function of n, the number of quarters. So what this means, the amount of money you have in quarters depends on how many quarters you have. Sounds easy, right? So that description, that statement describes a function. Okay, then another way to represent the same function is with an input-output diagram. Let me show you what that looks like for this same example. The input is n, the number of quarters. And the output is V, the value of your quarters. And then in the box, you have an expression. How to go from n to V? Multiply 0.25 by n, the number of quarters, because each quarter is $0.25. Would you close the door for me, Michael? Thank you for noticing that sound. I don't know what that is. Is it my TV? Thank you. I'll fix that. to show you how this relates to the independent and dependent variable. So this is important in your notes. The output depends on the input. So the output is the dependent variable. Let me say that again. The output depends on the input. So the output is the dependent variable. And the input doesn't depend on anything. It's the independent variable. You need to write that down. That's really important to keep track of. And when you get into your science classes in high school, they're going to be talking about independent variables and dependent variables. So make sure you can tell those apart. And if you think it's easy, let me tell you, I've always gotten these confused. What? Which one's independent? Which one's dependent? Because you can change them. You can decide that now this one depends on that, depending on your experiments. Anyway, when you look at the diagram, just remember the output depends on the input. Okay, another way that we can represent a function is with, and put number 3 on here, this is the third way to represent a function. You can represent with an equation. And that's something you are used to because we did that a lot in Unit 3 and 4. We wrote equations. So now I'm going to take this same example of quarters and write an equation. The value of your quarters equals 0.25 times n, the number of quarters. Please write that down. Here's an equation representing the same function. Hey, Michael, would you take all the food and put it on the counter? I forgot to do that. And she wants to take the tray. Thank you so much, Michael. When you have an equation of a function, you still need to know which one is the independent variable and which one is the dependent variable. And I want you to be able to tell just by looking. So look at this equation, and I want you to see that V depends on N. First, you would put in the number of quarters. So the N is the input. That's the independent variable. Please label that. Put in N, the input, the independent variable. N doesn't depend on anything. It's just the number of quarters that you have. Then the value of the quarters, well, that depends on how many quarters you have. So I want you to just by looking at an equation, I want you to be able to see that whichever variable is isolated, that is your dependent variable. And that is your output. You can go ahead and label that as well, the output. Okay, there's one more representation of this same function. I'll just wait a second while you write down the equation. V depends on N. Can you see that just by looking? I hope so. If you can, that'll help you a lot. Notice that the dependent variable is isolated, and you need to realize that for later. Okay, the fourth way to represent a function is with a table, and you've done this many times. But I want to show it one more time with dependent variable and independent variable. So here is a table. And we've already called this a table of ordered pairs or an input-output table. I'm going to show this one more time. With this same example, V is the dependent variable. We're going to put that on the right side of the equation. N is the independent variable. We're going to put that on the left side of the table. I said equation, I meant table. Go ahead and label that in your notes that now you have the input, which is independent. You're going to put that on the left side. It's coming first because first you put in the input. And on the right side of the table, that's your output, your dependent variable. And we did this many times with tables of ordered pairs. We had X on the left and Y on the right. And I'll quickly fill in this table. Let's say you had 1 quarter, 5 quarters, 10 quarters, or 20 quarters. The value of 1 quarter is 25 cents. The value of 5 quarters is $1.25. It's 5 times 0.25. So imagine I'm just putting in N into my equation. If I put in N equals 10, I get V equals $2.50. If I input N equals 20 quarters, I get $5. Normally, we would put the dollar sign in the top of the table. Next week, or in the next lesson, there's one more thing you're going to learn, and I'm going to go ahead and put it in the notes right now. To help you with your next lesson, you need to know the 5th way to represent a function, and that is with a graph. Oh my gosh, this is the last one. Don't worry. When you graph a function, you put the independent variable on the x-axis. Remember, the x-axis goes left to right. So down here is independent variable. In our example, the independent variable is n, the number of quarters. And on the y-axis, up and down, you put the dependent variable. And in our example, the dependent variable is v, the value of quarters. When you label your axes, you should say what each one was. So v is the value of quarters. You'll put the units in parentheses. Maybe something like this. Value, V, is dollars. And N, we'll put number of quarters. You'll need to do this a lot in your chemistry and physics classes next year in high school, or next year, sophomore year. So please pay attention now and get all this in your notes. Then you can do chemistry assignments and physics assignments very quickly. So number of quarters, N. And then what is the units on that? It's just number of quarters. You might even put it in parentheses, depending on your style. Please remember, dependent variable is Y. Independent variable is X. So if you have 1 quarter, that's 25 cents. If you have 5 quarters, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's $1.25. If you have 10 quarters, maybe that's here, you have $2.50. And if you have 20 quarters, maybe that's right here, you have $5. Here's a graph of this linear function. Phew, you guys did a good job taking all these notes nonstop. You have learned The vocabulary is a function of means y is a function of x means y depends on x. You have learned the vocabulary dependent variable, which is the output. You have learned the vocabulary independent variable, which is your input. Just remember, output depends on input. You have learned that functions can be represented as a description. The value of some quarters, v, is a function of n, the number of quarters. You have learned that the same function can be represented as an input-output diagram, where the output depends on the input. You have learned to represent the same function with an equation. The output, v, depends on n, the input. You have learned to represent it as a table, where the output depends on the input. The dependent variable depends on the independent variable. And finally, you have learned to graph the functions. The independent variable is on the x-axis. The dependent variable is on the y-axis. So we get v equals 0.25x. And here is a graph of that function. Oops, I said x, but we're using n. If I used y, it would be y equals 0.25x. You can use any variables you want, but you must have dependent variable isolated, and then an expression containing the independent variable. Okay, I'm finished. There we go. Good job, guys.